For this morning is Genesis 22, 1 to 19. And as I'm just reading it, I'd invite you just to close your eyes and visualise the story as we're going along, just to help bring it to life just a little bit more. Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. "Abraham," God called. "Yes," he replied, "here I am." "Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will show you." The next morning Abraham got up early. He saddled his donkey and took 2 of his servants with him, along with his son Isaac. Then he chopped wood for the fire for a burnt offering and set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day of their journey, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. "Stay here with the donkey," Abraham told the servants. "The boy and I will travel a little further. We will worship there, and then we will come right back." So Abraham placed the wood for the burnt offering on Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them walked on together, Isaac turned to Abraham and said, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "We have the fire and the wood," the boy said, "but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" "God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son," Abraham answered, and they both walked on together. When they arrived at the place where God had told them to go, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. Then he tied his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. At that moment, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Yes," Abraham replied, "here I am." "Don't lay a hand on the boy," the angel said. "Do not hurt him in any way, for now I know that you truly fear God. You have not withheld from me even your son, your only son." Then Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. So he took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham named the place Yahweh-Jireh, which means "the Lord will provide." To this day, people still use that name as a proverb. On the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. Then the angel of the Lord called again to Abraham from heaven. "This is what the Lord says. Because you have obeyed me and have not withheld even your son, your only son, I swear by my own name that I will certainly bless you. I will multiply your descendants beyond number, like the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will conquer the cities of their enemies, and through your descendants all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Then they returned to the servants and travelled back to Beersheba, where Abraham continued to live.
Although I've already been up here, good morning. It's nothing like reinforcement, is it? If you looked at Brent's little intro on Friday in the newsletter, and then we've heard in the little children's address, and now we get the 3rd time of the sermon. So I said to Kath this morning, I don't have a 3-point sermon, but I think in some ways we've probably already had a bit of reinforcement. Chapter 22. I'm focusing on verses 1 to 19, the testing of Abraham. Maybe Catherine can bring up a slide. In 1653, Rembrandt painted this painting and titled it "The Sacrifice of Isaac," Sacrifice of Esau. It's in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. And there's a few things probably, if you look at it, that you'll notice, or I can point out. You can see Abraham's hand over Isaac's face. And I think if you look at in detail, we can't from this sort of scale, but there's just the glimpse of one of Isaac's eyes in sort of terror under his hand. There is the angel grasping the hand of Abraham, and then you see the knife falling, pointed still in the direction of Isaac. In Jewish tradition, this passage, this Genesis chapter 22 passage, is known as the Akedah. It's the binding of Isaac, and it comes from the word akod, which is, so it says there in that passage that Abraham bound Isaac, and that word akod, the word to bind, is in fact the only place in the Old Testament where we find this word. Abraham bound Isaac, the word akod. And so in Jewish tradition, it's been known as the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And then, of course, that gives us a bit of, in some ways, an interpretation already, because, as I mentioned, the title that I've sort of got from Brent was The Testing of Abraham. Rembrandt titled it The Sacrifice of Isaac. And there's a bit of an interpretive focus there already. Genesis 22, it is, of course, a well-known story. One commentator says it is one of the most beautiful narratives in the whole of the Old Testament. And if you read that little spiel from Brent on Friday, he mentioned the fact that it's one of the most moving passages in the Old Testament. Someone else said that it holds a special place in world literature. And yet at the same time, it's a terrible, if I can use that word, probably to sort of cover a number of things. It is a terrible story to read. It has everything: pathos, shock, child sacrifice, love, fear, testing to the very edge of human endurance, loss, gain, but also hope and triumph. And we probably have to ask, as we start looking at it, where does it fit into the Abraham story? Because as you may or may not realise, this is the last sermon, the last time that we're actually addressing the Abraham series. We've gone through it. This has come to the climax. And of course, a lot has happened as we've read through and looked at various passages in Genesis over the last number of months. There's a lot we've covered, but there's some things that we haven't covered as well. For example, chapters 18 and 19, the passage of Sodom and Gomorrah. If you were here last week, you noticed that Mark Wilkinson sort of studiously avoided that passage and chose to do something else. And look, I don't really blame him. I thought he was avoiding a little bit, but it's probably not the easiest passage to preach on. So I don't blame him. I think we can forgive him for that. I noticed that Robert Heyman had he addressed chapter 17 the week before that, but it wasn't really a big recurse through the chapter. So there's a few things that we have missed. We've had some incidental references to chapters 20 and 21, where we finally see the birth of the promised child Isaac in chapter 21, as well as the banishment of Ishmael. And so we come to chapter 22, the climax, in a sense, of the Abraham story. And here in the middle of his life, now, as we'll get to see, of course, if you looked at the passage just before, or the chapter before, we find out that Abraham has now turned 100. So maybe I'm a bit facetious when I say he's in the prime or the middle of his life, but you've got to remember that he dies at 175. So if we sort of do our mathematics, maybe he's in the middle there somewhere. Okay, maybe he's sort of pushing towards the higher end. I could probably say that I'm in the prime of life and a few others around about our age, but maybe that's not the case. But there's something that we find, of course, in verse 1 of chapter 22. Let me just get to it. Here in the middle of his life, God tests Abraham. Now, I think we shouldn't miss this. Here in verse 1, sometime later, God tested Abraham. Now, the point is that we, as the hearers or the readers of this story, of this biblical passage, we are told that it is a test. Abraham doesn't have that luxury. It is not like God says to him, now Abraham, I'm about to test you, get ready. All we find that God tells Abraham in the narrative is, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. And I think it's something that we need to realise, because you see there's all these questions certainly that came up in terms of the Enlightenment, some of the Enlightenment commentators who balk at this whole point. Do we have here a passage of child sacrifice being advocated by God? And so it raises all sort of questions. I think the point is that we have the luxury as the readers and the hearers of the text, of the passage, should I say, to know that what God is doing in this case is testing Abraham. Yes, it's a real test, but it is a test nonetheless. And that's something I think that we need to realise to allay the thorny issue of such things as child sacrifice. This is a narrative. It is a story about Abraham, but it is for us. Now, maybe the idea of testing makes us a little bit uncomfortable. Yes, exams, maybe the young people will attest to this, are not nice, but they serve a purpose. Testing has its place. For example, earlier this year I had my gallbladder out in a surgery. I would want to know that the surgeon who's about to operate on me is qualified through some sort of verification process, so through some sort of testing process, that they were qualified to perform these sorts of operations, things that are life and death. We find, of course, testing elsewhere in the Bible. For example, Israel in the desert. Joseph is testing his brothers. Daniel in the fiery furnace, Jesus in the garden, and the disciples were tested. You remember that on one occasion when Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and Jesus then comes to him, or Peter comes to Jesus, and Jesus says to Peter, "Do you love me?" And you remember that sort of painful discourse between the two of them. Do you love me? Yes, you know I love you, Lord. Do you love me? Do you love me? And so we have testing in other parts of the Bible. Have you ever been tested? Would you call it enjoyable? Probably not. Now imagine testing that costs everything. And that's what we find here in chapter 22 of Genesis with Abraham. Some of you may remember the story that is often told, or has been told, I'm sure you may have heard it, about the story of the bridge master. There is a bridge, and apart from the fact that in some ways it's got a bit of a life of its own, it apparently is based upon an actual incident. But there's the story of the bridge master who is in control of the drawbridge that goes up and down over the river. And the ships pass along the river and under the drawbridge. It has to be raised for the ships to go through, but it has to be lowered when the train comes through, because this is a bridge with a railway, a train track on it. And so the story goes, the bridge master has a young son, and he takes that young son one day into the control room where he is operating and working. And at some stage, the bridge is up because the ships are transferring back and forth underneath it. But then a train comes, and the bridge master is now responsible for operating the levers that will bring the bridge down so that the train can go across. And as he's about to do this, he spies that his son, who has been playing around, has got down somehow into the gears that will operate the drawbridge. And he is caught there. And the bridge master at this point in time, at that moment, has this terrible decision that he has to make between maintaining the bridge up so that his son will be spared, or lowering the bridge, knowing that he will be crushed in the gears, so that the train can go across with hundreds of people and they won't fall to their death. And there is in this point in time, in this terrible moment, this father has to make this decision about what he will do. The story continues on that he actually makes that fateful decision, and as he pulls the lever, his son is crushed. But the bridge comes down and the train goes across the bridge, and all those people that are sitting there, they look out and they see, some of them glimpse in the busyness of their lives and just the mundane, they glimpse up and see the grief on this bridge master's face in the control room. They are oblivious to what has just happened. And of course, this is often told in relation to Jesus dying on the cross. The Father gives up the Son. And most people are oblivious to this. But the sacrifice has been made. But maybe that's the point about this. It's something I think not to be missed, that when God calls to Abraham and tests him, he is not asking of something of Abraham that he was not willing to do himself. But that, of course, that doesn't lessen the tension in the story in Genesis 22. So verse 2, for example, you note how the narrator, in this case, let's say Moses as the narrator of the story, tells us. He has 3 imperatives in verse 2. Take, go, and sacrifice. Take your only son, Isaac, whom you love, go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there. There's some commentary translations, and of course we actually don't see it. Most of the English translations miss, but there's a particle in the Hebrew. If you're not quite sure what a particle is, then don't worry, because I had to go and do a bit of a refresher myself. A particle, for example, in English is if I say to you, go and look up on Google, this or that. You don't go to the computer screen, enter Google, and then look up, do you? We know what the word up in that case means. It means, give attention to, do some research. But that is a particle in English. So there is a particle in the Hebrew, nun, aleph. And it's not actually translated here in the text in the NIVs, but it's something like, take now, Abraham, or take, please. Take your son, please, go and sacrifice him there, where on the mountain that I will tell you. And in some ways, I think it's something that we ought to take notice of. As I said, the decisions that translators often make, we can miss that. But God is not an unfeeling God. He is not a demanding, authoritarian figure that points the finger at Abraham and says, you go and take your son. There is an element, I think, that comes through the reading that says that God knows what he is asking or calling Abraham to do. By the way, for the Lord of the Rings fans, and I'm not sure if there is anybody who's a Lord of the Ring fan apart from Brent here, but you might notice the word Moriah. Well, actually, I know that Kenneth used Moriah, and that's the way we often say it. It's actually in the Hebrew, it's Moriah. And I've thought about for those of you who know the story of the Lord of the Rings, there's the mines of Moriah under the misty mountains. I'm not sure if Tolkien was influenced by Genesis chapter 22. But Moriah is identified with the hills of Jerusalem. Because remember, he's living, at the time, Abraham is living in essentially the land of the Palestines at Beersheba. And he's asked to go, essentially 3 days' ride, to the mountains, to the hills of Moriah, to the one that I will identify, God says to him. How amazing that this story, as there was a reference in the little child's video this morning, looks forward to another only loved son who died just outside of Jerusalem for us. Now you notice how Abraham has changed in the passages of some of the things we were reading and listening to and hearing about over the last few months, from chapter 12 up to even up to chapter 20. He has changed from Abram to Abraham. He is no longer scheming and manipulating like we have found him in some of the earlier chapters, even if it may be a little overblown. There was an element of his scheming and manipulating. He is now a man of faith. Yes, he is a bit older and wiser, we trust, but we see it in his response to the test. There is quiet obedience. It doesn't mean, of course, that he is unfeeling. There is no doubt internal turmoil, and that's portrayed in verse 3. Early in the morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him his two of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. It seems that Abraham's preparation is a little bit out of order, isn't it? You'd think that he'd first go and do the preparation with the wood, get that all cut, then put it onto the donkey, then he goes off, which ultimately does happen. But there's a bit of disorder going on here, and I wonder if it's Moses' intent, the author's intent here, that it shows through Abraham's going through the motions, but it's a little bit disjointed. There's a little bit, a bit out of order, because Abraham is not just an unfeeling father in this case. There's obedience, but there's also that internal turmoil that he is going through. We've got to remember, of course, that while I mentioned that this is a story, this is a narrative for us, we are talking about real people, real emotions. And of course, we've got the question now, probably that you've been thinking all along. How could Abraham do this? How could he be willing to sacrifice his son? Well, I want to go to chapter 11 of Hebrews, because I think that is certainly what I would put it as a key in this point in time, in this passage here in Genesis. Back to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Some of the commentators say, you can't use this because this is a reading back into the text in Genesis. Resurrection wasn't a factor there at that particular time. I'm not so sure about that. I think that very clearly we know that the author of Hebrews, yes, by revelation of the Spirit, knows what was going on in Abraham's mind. It had been revealed to him what was going on in Abraham's mind at that time. But Abraham had reason that even if God had taken or would take Isaac, that God could raise him from the dead. And then the narrative speeds up. There's actually, if you look at the story, the way the story is told, there is a masterfulness here, because at various points in time through this little passage, through Genesis chapter 22, the narrative speeds up and slows down. It almost like it goes through certain aspects very quickly, and then it slows down almost into slow motion. And we see a particular point in time, and then it speeds up again and then slows down. And so in verses chapter 4 to 6, the narrative speeds up. It goes through the passage of going out and getting to the place. And it says, on the third day. What does that remind you of? On the third day. You see, you've got to remember, from the time that Abraham started off on the journey, Isaac was as good as dead to him. But now 3 days later, as he comes to the end of that journey, as we shall see, he is restored. Isaac is restored to his father. Now in verse 5 it says, Abraham says to the two servants, they are referred to, by the way, as well as lads in the text. He takes these lads with him as well as Isaac. And he says to the lads, stay there, and then we will come back to you. So there's a bit of a claim, some of the commentators, isn't Abraham being a bit disingenuous here? I mean, he knows what he is about to do. But again, I think not if we take chapter 11 of Hebrews seriously. There was that trust, there was that faith in God that he could restore Isaac to Abraham. And then the narrative slows down again in verses 7 to 8. And Isaac asks, of course, there's the really poignant part here where Abraham and Isaac are walking together up to the mountain. And Isaac turns to his father. Well, we've got the wood and the fire and the knife. Where is the lamb? And of course, Abraham's answer, God himself will provide the lamb. And we might say that both in that discourse between Isaac and Abraham. We might say that Isaac and Abraham both spoke better than they knew. Because this is, of course, one of the great existential questions. Where is the Lamb? Who can take away the sins of the world? Now, of course, you may say, well, Gerald, you're reading a little bit more into this particular text in Genesis 22 than is there. I mean, I am the one who normally espouses a proper exegetical reading of the text. But we are a people of the book. And the Bible has themes, great themes, cosmic themes that are running through it. Who would deny the parable or the parallels here? A father willing to sacrifice his son, his only son, whom he loves, but who ultimately doesn't have to, and a father who sees his only son die on the cross out of love for all. Abraham did not spare Isaac. He was willing to be obedient to God. Compare Romans chapter 8, verses 31 and 32. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? And John, not 31, isn't it? John 9:16. Am I right? For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. There are other parallels, by the way, between this story in 22 of Abraham and Isaac and Jesus. Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century, 120 AD, noted that Isaac carried the wood, Jesus carried the cross. 316, yes, right, sorry. There you go. Isaac carried the wood, Jesus carried the cross. And now we come to the Akedah, the binding of Isaac in verses 9 and 10. And again, the narrative speeds up. The tension is raised. The altar is built. The wood is arranged. Isaac is bound and the knife is raised. And of course, at this point in time, my practical brain goes, how did Abraham do all that? Remember, he is now well over 100. And Isaac is referred to as a lad. By the way, there are arguments for Isaac's age all the way from age 7 up to 37. In early Jewish tradition, that was the age that they understood that Isaac was at the time of this passage. But of course, as a result, there is that whole understanding there in that Jewish tradition that Isaac is the faithful son because he cooperates, he allows himself to be bound. If we remember that picture from Rembrandt, I don't think he quite takes that line. Now, I don't know about you, but it's pretty hard to see how Abraham could do all this if Isaac resisted. Now, maybe, as I said, Abraham is at the zenith of his life. He's in the middle of his life, and but he's getting on, of course. I have a father who is now, and my dad is in his 90s, his early 90s, going on to 92. And he is certainly not the man he once was. He's a lot frailer. He's walking with a walker now. And he's not even Abraham's age yet. Yeah, I know the story in the Old Testament about the ages and all that sort of stuff, yeah. But I compare my dad, who's in his early 90s now, with my son, who's now in his mid-20s. But, even when he was in his teens, you wouldn't take him on too easily and think you could win in a bit of horseplay. So I sort of think, well, if I compare my boy and my father, that'd be a bit of a match if it wasn't a bit of cooperation, was it? And of course, we think about how all this works. The point is it's not ultimately important. The text doesn't dwell on these intricacies. It doesn't give us all the technicalities. What it does dwell on at this point in time is what God does. He intervenes. And so we find in verse 11 that the angel of the Lord called from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. There's that repeat, that interjection. By By the way, you notice that there is some parallels in chapter 22 with chapter 21, if we'd spent time there as well. In the story of Hagar and Ishmael, in chapter 21, verse 17, the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. The same thing, there is this sort of repetition. There's parallels in these stories going on there as well. And Abraham's response, "Here I am." There is repetition here in the text. There's 3 times in this chapter that Abraham responds to voices. First to God, then to Isaac, and then to the angel. "Here I am ready." I wonder if we are as ready to hear the call of God and respond. Some of the older folk may know the company, the gramophone company, HMV, stands for His Master's Voice. And their iconic image or icon is that of a dog listening to the gramophone as the Master's voice, which has been recorded, is played back to him. It's now, I think the company's become EMI, transferred over many years. But that's the iconic image, listening for the Master's voice. By the way, I'm not trying to sort of make a bit of a parallel here between us and God and the dog listening to the gramophone. The question, though, is, are we listening? "Here I am, Lord. What do you want of me?" And then we have verse 12. God says, "Now I know. Now I know." And this is, I think, one of these conundrums that we have in the Scriptures that gets theologians tied up in knots, because there is the whole thing about the immutability and the omniscience of God. Immutability, the unchangeableness, the omniscience of God, the all-knowingness. And of course, the point is, God says here, "Now I know." What do you mean, now you know? You knew all along, didn't you, what Abraham would do? Yes, he does. That's what we aspire. We say, we acknowledge God is all-knowing and He is unchanging. And yet here we find God saying, "Now I know, Abraham." And of course, as a result, he changes. He makes some pronouncements about what He will do for Abraham. If He's all-knowing, then how can He not have known already? It's a tension, I think, that we simply have to live with. If we think that we can understand the Scriptures and understand God, and by the time we go to glory, we've got it all worked out, then we've missed something. There is an element in which we will never know God. Yes, we have to hold these things in tension. Yes, we will know, and yes, we will never know fully. I remember Fee, I probably have to bring him in because it's one of my heroes in the faith, Gordon Fee, who talked about the Scriptures and trying to delve into the Scriptures. And his point was that the issue for us is not knowing everything that there is in Scripture and having a perfect understanding. The issue for us is knowing, or being obedient, should I say, to what we do know. And that is a far greater issue for us. In verses 13 and 14, God provides the lamb, or the ram, of course, should I say. And Abraham calls that place Jehovah-Jireh. Now, I know that we bring it into English and we say Jehovah-Jireh. And by the way, we have to do that because if we're going to sing the song, Jehovah-Jireh, my provider, it doesn't sound so good if we have Jehovah-Jireh, my provider. It just doesn't work, does it? Okay, so that's why, and I'm not sure it's why we do it in English, but nonetheless, okay, it's sort of the way we've done it. Jehovah-Jireh. God provides. And then in verses 15 to 19, the Lord calls a second time, because you have not withheld your son, your only son. And you notice again, that is also emphasized 3 times in this passage. Your son, your only son, whom you love. There is some promises of God. What is things that God will now do for Abraham? I will surely bless you. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars and as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And there's both a throwback to some of the earlier promises and the commitments that God has made there in the earlier chapters. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. But there is a new element here, and as numerous as the sand on the seashore. You will take possession of cities. The Hebrew literally says the gates. You will take the gates of your enemies. But of course, in that time, to control the gate was to control the city. So the Our modern translations generally have "you will take the cities of your enemies, and through you all nations will be blessed." See, the thing is, it's not ultimately a story about Isaac, regardless of what Rembrandt may think, or even Abraham. It is ultimately a story about the God of Abraham, who loves and who provides, Jehovah Jireh. Our God, who provides through grace and mercy, who provides the Lamb, who forgives our sins, who loves us, who cares for us, who chooses to bless us. So, as we finish, let me ask a few questions. Are you listening for your Master's voice? Is your attitude one of ready obedience? Abraham had learned to trust. What about us? Is there anything that we are still withholding from God? Does our faith recognize that it is our Father who is Jehovah Jireh, our provider, who has brought us into his family through his only Son, Jesus Christ? It is these qualities, I think, that demonstrate that we are truly descendants of Abraham. Amen. Can I ask you to stand with us? And I'm going to get the band to come up as well.